I felt the weight of my world collapse as I watched her eyes darken, those same eyes that once looked at me with what I'd mistaken for love. It took just 3 words, "You're broke now," for my daughter's mask to slip completely, revealing the cold calculation beneath years of pretended affection. In that moment, with my assets temporarily frozen and my future uncertain, I discovered what truly matters in this life, and it wasn't the wealth I'd spent decades building. At 65, I never expected to find myself in this position. For nearly 40 years, I'd built my business from nothing into a thriving enterprise that had afforded me all the comforts I could want, but more importantly, it had given me the means to open my home to Claire, a troubled teenager I met through a youth outreach program 7 years ago. She had been bounced between foster homes, her mother imprisoned on drug charges, her father long gone. When I first met her, she was a guarded 16-year-old who simply wanted a place to sleep in peace. Something in her quiet determination resonated with me, and after months of paperwork and vetting, I welcomed her into my life. The legal dispute that froze my assets was unexpected but manageable, just 3 days until everything would be released. Yet when I explained this to Claire after she demanded a $2 million lake house as her gift, I saw a transformation that chilled me to my core. Gone was any pretense of warmth or gratitude. In its place stood a calculating stranger who smashed a glass in rage and immediately produced termination of adoption papers she had clearly prepared in advance. "Just say it, you're broke," she spat, her voice filled with disgust. "I knew you couldn't be trusted, always showing off with your money." I said nothing about the fact that my assets would be unfrozen in just 3 days. Instead, I signed her papers, watching as she ransacked my home on her way out, taking anything she thought valuable. The betrayal cut deeper than any business loss ever could. 7 years of memories of meals shared, holidays celebrated, dreams discussed, all revealed as nothing more than a transaction in her eyes. 3 days later, she called repeatedly, angry that I wasn't at the courthouse yet to finalize our separation. I took my time, curious to see her face when she learned the truth. When I arrived, she stood with her biological father, both wearing smug expressions that quickly dissolved when my assistant pulled up in a brand new Ferrari with news that all company operations had resumed normally. "Your assets, they were unfrozen," Claire stammered, reality crashing down around her. "This morning," I replied calmly, watching as her face paled with the realization of what she had thrown away. She fell to her knees right there on the courthouse steps, begging forgiveness through tears, suddenly remembering to call me Mom again. But I remained unmoved. This wasn't remorse, it was fear, not of losing me, but of losing the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to, with quiet dignity. I instructed my assistant to cancel all her accounts, cards, and access to my properties. Her choice had been made 3 days ago, and now she would have to live with it. Later, when she appeared on my doorstep, kneeling in theatrical repentance, I recognized it for what it was, another performance. What she valued most had never been my love or guidance. It was appearances, status, and comfort. When her friends arrived and witnessed her humiliation, she finally understood the true cost of her betrayal. In the weeks that followed, I returned to the rhythm of my life and business with a surprising lightness. The company crisis passed, and I found myself focusing on long-neglected personal interests, gardening, painting, planning travel, not as escape, but as exploration. When a handwritten letter arrived from Claire, expressing what seemed like genuine remorse. I didn't respond directly. Instead, I arranged for an anonymous scholarship for her vocational training, not out of forgiveness, but because I believed in second chances, even if they couldn't include me. "You seem steadier than most people I know," remarked Samuel, a thoughtful community leader I'd met at a charity function. As we shared dinner one evening, "It's not steadiness," I replied. "It's learning not to cling so tightly anymore." Through this painful experience, I discovered that happiness doesn't come from possessing people or accumulating wealth. It comes from no longer fearing what might be lost. Once you find the courage to walk alone, you realize you already have everything you need. There's still so much I don't know about the future, but this much is certain: I am both strong enough and soft enough to meet whatever tomorrow brings. The day my wealth vanished was the day I truly saw my daughter's heart. I'll never forget the look in Claire's eyes when I told her about my frozen assets, how quickly warmth transformed to disgust, how readily love gave way to calculation. It was as though someone had pulled back a curtain, revealing that the family bond I'd cherished for 7 years had been nothing more than a financial arrangement all along. I'm Eleanor Wilson, 67 years old, and until 3 days ago, I was the proud CEO of Wilson Enterprises. A legal dispute had temporarily frozen my assets, just a brief setback, with everything set to return in less than a week. But when I explained this to Claire, my adopted daughter of 7 years, her reaction shattered any illusions I'd carefully maintained about our relationship. "What kind of situation leads to frozen assets?" she snapped, her voice dripping with contempt. "Just say it. You're broke. I knew you couldn't be trusted, always showing off with your money." Tang, the beautiful young woman I'd raised since she was a troubled 16-year-old foster child, was suddenly a stranger, smashing her glass against my kitchen counter in rage. The transformation was immediate and complete. Gone was the affectionate daughter who'd called me Mom and shared Sunday dinners in our Vermont estate. In her place stood a calculating opportunist who had apparently prepared for this moment, pulling termination of adoption papers from her designer handbag, documents she must have arranged weeks before. 7 years earlier, I'd met Claire through a youth outreach program where I volunteered after my husband's death. She'd been through 3 foster homes already, her mother imprisoned on drug charges, her father nowhere to be found. When I first approached her, she was huddled in a corner, clutching a tattered notebook. "What do you need?" I'd asked gently. Without looking up, she'd whispered, "Just a place where I can sleep in peace." Something in her quiet dignity had touched my heart. I'd gone through all the proper channels, state applications, background checks, home studies, and finally adoption. Those early years weren't easy, but watching her bloom from a withdrawn teenager into a confident young woman had brought meaning back to my life after years of loneliness. Or so I'd thought. "It's just $2 million for the lake house," she'd argued earlier that day, showing me pictures of a luxury property on Lake Champlain. "That's barely a month's income for you. Why are you being so stingy?" I'd given her everything: private schooling, European vacations, designer clothes, a trust fund, even a Lincoln Navigator for her 21st birthday. I'd opened my home, my heart, and my bank account, but apparently all that mattered was what I could continue to provide. "If you end up on the streets, that's your problem," she hissed after I signed her termination papers. "I stayed with you because I wanted a good life. If you can't keep that going, why would I stick around?" Those words echoed in my mind for 3 days as I waited for my assets to be released. When she called from the courthouse, impatiently demanding I hurry to finalize our separation, I took my time. I wanted to see her face when she learned the truth that my bankruptcy had lasted exactly 72 hours. The moment my assistant arrived in a brand new Jaguar, explaining that company operations had fully resumed, Claire's face drained of color. She fell to her knees on the courthouse steps, suddenly remembering to call me Mom again, tears streaming down her carefully made-up face. "Please," she begged, clutching at my coat. "I was wrong. I just let the money get to my head. You can hit me, yell at me, anything. Just take me back." But I stood unmoved. This wasn't remorse. It was panic. Not fear of losing me, but of losing the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to. With quiet dignity, I instructed my assistant to cancel all her credit cards and trust fund access. She had made her choice, and now she would live with it. Later, when she appeared on my doorstep with her father, both attempting a grotesque performance of repentance, I simply watched as her so-called friends witnessed her humiliation. What she had valued most was never my love or guidance. It was appearances, status, comfort. The most extravagant thing in this world isn't a luxury car or a designer purse, I told her softly. It's a person's heart, and you've already spent all of yours. In the months that followed, I discovered something surprising: freedom. Without the constant calculation of Claire's demands, I returned to my company with renewed purpose and to my life with unexpected lightness. I planted gardens, took up painting again, made plans for travel. When her letter of apology eventually arrived, I didn't respond directly. Instead, I arranged an anonymous scholarship for her vocational training, not out of forgiveness, but because I believed in second chances, even if they couldn't include me. "You seem at peace," observed James, a thoughtful community leader I'd met at a charity function. "I've learned that happiness isn't about what you have," I replied, "but about no longer fearing what might be lost. Once you find the courage to walk alone, you realize you already have everything you need." I never expected to find betrayal neatly printed on legal paper, but there it was, a termination of adoption agreement that Jessica had obviously prepared long before my assets were frozen. The document sat between us on my mahogany coffee table, its clinical language a stark contrast to the 7 years of family photos decorating my walls. In that moment, watching her impatient finger tapping beside the signature line, I realized our entire relationship had been built on a foundation of sand. "Sign it," she demanded, her voice lacking even a hint of the warmth I'd grown accustomed to hearing. "My father is waiting for me to come home for dinner." At 68, I'd spent my life building Harrison Industries from the ground up, weathering economic storms and corporate battles that would have crushed a less determined soul. But nothing had prepared me for this particular blow. 3 days earlier, a legal dispute had resulted in a temporary freeze on all my assets. It was a minor setback. The matter would be resolved within 72 hours, but Jessica didn't know that part. All she knew was that her wealthy adoptive mother suddenly couldn't provide the $2 million lakefront property she'd demanded as her gift. I'd met Jessica when she was 16, a defiant yet vulnerable girl cycling through her third foster home. Her mother was serving time for drug charges, her father largely absent, except when he needed money. During a volunteer session at a youth outreach program, she'd caught my attention by her startling answer to a simple question. "What do you need?" I'd asked, noticing her sitting alone. Without looking up from her tattered notebook, she'd whispered, "Just a place where I can sleep in peace." Something in those words, the modest request amid such profound loss, had touched me deeply. I wasn't looking to become anyone's mother at that stage in my life. My husband had passed years earlier, and my focus had been entirely on building my business in Philadelphia. But 6 months later, after rigorous vetting, home studies, and mountains of paperwork, Jessica moved into my Chestnut Hill home. Those early years hadn't been easy. She'd arrive home past curfew, challenge every boundary, test my patience daily, but gradually, the walls came down. I remember clearly the first time she called me Mom. It was after Sunday dinner, nearly a year after she'd moved in. I'd simply nodded and continued clearing dishes. But that word echoed in my heart for days afterward. By the time I formally adopted her, we'd established what I believed was a genuine bond. I'd supported her through college, brought her into business meetings, taught her everything I knew about financial security and independence. Never once did I imagine she viewed me as nothing more than an ATM with a pulse. "Hurry up," Jessica snapped, pulling me back to the present moment. "You're broke now, so what's the point of dragging this out?" I studied her face, this young woman I'd clothed, housed, and loved for 7 years, searching for any flicker of the girl who once baked me birthday cookies or left handwritten notes in my briefcase before big meetings. There was nothing there but cold calculation and barely disguised disgust. "Didn't you say you had plans with friends tonight?" I asked quietly. Her eyes narrowed. "Please, if I hadn't said that, would you have handed over the money so easily?" That final sentence stripped away any remaining illusions. I picked up the pen and signed my name, watching 25 years of business acumen fail to protect me from the most personal kind of fraud. "I hope you don't regret this," I said evenly. Jessica laughed, already gathering valuables from around the room. "Getting rid of a burden like you, I couldn't be happier." As she walked out the door, declaring we'd finalize everything at the courthouse in 3 days, I sat in silence. The home that had once felt warm with shared memories now echoed with her final words. She'd never really been my daughter. She'd been playing a role, waiting for the perfect moment to exit the stage once the performance no longer paid. 3 days later, I arrived deliberately late to the courthouse, curious to see her reaction when she learned the truth. As I expected, Jessica was pacing impatiently, her biological father hovering nearby with a smug expression. "Where have you been?" she demanded. "I've been waiting forever." I said nothing until after the hearing concluded. Only then, as we stood on the courthouse steps, did I casually mention that my assets had been unfrozen that morning. The company was fine. My fortune remained intact. The color drained from her face as my assistant pulled up in a new Mercedes, confirming that operations had fully resumed. Jessica stumbled backward, momentarily speechless before dropping to her knees, suddenly sobbing. "Mom, please," she begged, clutching at my coat. "I was wrong. I just let the money get to my head. You can hit me, yell at me, anything, just take me back." I looked down at her, unmoved. This wasn't remorse, it was fear, not of losing me, but of losing access to wealth. With quiet dignity, I instructed my assistant to cancel all her credit cards, trust funds, and access to my properties. "You made your choice," I said softly. "You signed the termination agreement with your own hands. You wanted freedom, now you have it." In the months that followed, I discovered an unexpected lightness. Without constantly calculating Jessica's next demand, I returned to my company with renewed purpose and to my life with fresh perspective. I planted gardens, took up painting, planned trips I'd always postponed. When her letter of apology eventually arrived, I didn't respond directly. Instead, I arranged an anonymous scholarship for her vocational training, not out of forgiveness, but because I believed in second chances, even if they couldn't include me. "You seem at peace," observed William, a thoughtful community foundation director I'd met at a charity function. I've learned that happiness isn't found in what you possess, I replied, but in no longer fearing what might be lost. I remember the exact moment when my wealth came back to me, not because of the money itself, but because of the truth it revealed. For 3 days, I had lived in a strange limbo, watching my adopted daughter Beth discard 7 years of our relationship the instant she believed I was broke. I never corrected her assumption. I simply waited for those 3 days to pass, knowing that sometimes silence teaches the most profound lessons. The morning my assets were unfrozen, I took my time getting ready for our court appointment. Beth had been calling incessantly since dawn, her voice growing increasingly agitated with each message. "I've been waiting at the courthouse for over an hour. Where are you?" The desperation in her voice wasn't about missing me. It was about finalizing our separation as quickly as possible. At 65, I've learned that patience reveals character more effectively than confrontation ever could. I'd built Morgan Enterprises from nothing into a flourishing business that had weathered 4 decades of economic ups and downs. A minor legal dispute had temporarily frozen my assets, nothing more than a procedural hiccup that would resolve itself in exactly 72 hours. But Beth didn't know that part. All she knew was that her wealthy adoptive mother suddenly couldn't provide the $2 million lake house she'd demanded as her gift. I still remember the way her face had transformed when I showed her the asset freeze notice. The warmth in her eyes, warmth I had mistaken for love, vanished instantly, replaced by something cold and calculating. "You're broke," she'd stated flatly, before pulling out termination of adoption papers she'd clearly prepared in advance. 7 years of shared holidays, birthday celebrations, and quiet Sunday mornings reading the papers together, all of it apparently worth nothing without financial gain. As I drove to the courthouse, deliberately arriving 2 hours late, I thought about the day I'd first met Beth. She was 16, on her 3rd foster home placement, her mother imprisoned on drug charges, her father long absent. During a volunteer session at a youth outreach program in New Hampshire, I'd approached her, asking simply, "What do you need?" Without looking up from her notebook, she'd whispered, "Just a place where I can sleep in peace." Something in that modest request touched me deeply. 6 months and countless background checks later, she moved into my lakeside home in New Hampshire. Those early years weren't easy. She tested boundaries, stayed out past curfew, challenged my authority. But gradually, she seemed to settle in. I remember clearly the first time she called me Mom, nearly a year after she'd arrived. I hadn't responded verbally, just cleared the dinner dishes with a small smile. But that word had echoed in my heart for days. By the time I legally adopted her, I believed we'd formed a genuine bond. I'd supported her through college, included her in business events, and taught her everything I knew about financial independence. Never once did I imagine she viewed me as nothing more than a bank account with a heartbeat. When I finally arrived at the courthouse, Beth was pacing impatiently at the entrance, her biological father, Gary, hovering nearby with a smug expression. As I approached, his eyes locked onto mine with open hostility. "Still putting on airs," he muttered. "When your money's gone, what makes you think you can talk tough?" I smiled faintly. "You seem very certain about my financial situation." The hearing itself was brief. My lawyer assured me the formal dissolution would process without complications. As we stepped outside afterward, I paused on the courthouse steps and turned to Beth. "What was that you said to me earlier?" I asked calmly. She blinked, caught off guard by the question. I leaned in slightly, my voice low but clear. "Beth, you can betray loyalty and throw away relationships, but don't you ever think you have the right to humiliate me." and she stepped back, a flicker of unease crossing her face. As I turned to leave, 2 security guards I'd arranged in advance politely blocked her path to me. "Ms. Morgan, your car is waiting," one of them said. I walked toward my waiting vehicle with measured steps. Just before reaching the door, I paused and glanced back. "Oh, almost forgot one more thing," I said casually. "My assets were fully unfrozen this morning." The silence that followed was absolute. Then came Beth's sharp, cutting laugh. "You really are something, Hep," she sneered. "Still putting on a show to protect your pathetic pride. Bankrupt is bankrupt. Stop pretending." I didn't respond. I simply stood waiting as a brand new red Lexus pulled smoothly into the parking lot. My assistant stepped out, immaculately dressed, and approached with professional ease. "Ms. Morgan, this is the vehicle you ordered 2 days ago," he announced, loud enough for Beth to hear. "Also, the company's operations have fully resumed after the temporary freeze. Would you like to issue any additional directives?" Beth's face drained of color as realization dawned. This wasn't a performance, it was reality. My company was fine, my wealth intact. She hadn't abandoned a sinking ship. She'd jumped from a vessel that had merely docked briefly for inspection. "This can't be happening," she shrieked. "You did this on purpose to humiliate me." I kept smiling, watching her unravel without saying a word. The truth needed no defense. Later that evening, as I sat in my study with a cup of tea, I reflected on what those 3 days had taught me. The asset freeze hadn't been a tragedy, it had been a revelation, showing me exactly who Beth was, beneath the veneer of daughterly affection. I hadn't expected betrayal to arrive so swiftly, but perhaps I should have. After all, what isn't built on genuine connection will always collapse under pressure. Months later, after receiving her letter of apology, I arranged an anonymous scholarship for her vocational training, not out of forgiveness, but because I believed in second chances, even if they couldn't include me. "You seem more at peace than most people I know," remarked Thomas, a thoughtful community foundation director I'd met at a charity function. "It's not peace," I replied gently. "It's clarity. And sometimes, clarity is the greatest fortune of all." The sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as I stood perfectly still, watching Emily's face transform from smug satisfaction to stunned disbelief. My revelation hung in the air between us. My assets were fully unfrozen this morning. 6 simple words that shattered the elaborate narrative she'd constructed that I, her adoptive mother of 7 years, was suddenly bankrupt and therefore worthless to her. I hadn't planned this moment of theater, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't savor it just a little. At 67, after building Bedford Enterprises from nothing into a thriving corporation that had weathered 4 decades of market fluctuations, I knew something about timing. And sometimes, timing is everything. 3 days earlier, Emily had terminated our relationship with cold efficiency, brandishing adoption dissolution papers she'd clearly prepared in advance. The moment she believed my wealth had evaporated due to a temporary asset freeze, she'd transformed from devoted daughter to calculating stranger. "You're broke," she'd stated flatly, as if those 2 words invalidated 7 years of birthdays, holidays, and quiet moments that I'd foolishly believed were building a genuine bond. Now, as we stood outside the Massachusetts courthouse, where she'd insisted on finalizing our separation, karma delivered its perfect response. My assistant Richard pulled into the parking lot driving a gleaming new Cadillac, stepping out immaculately dressed in a tailored suit. With practiced professional ease, he approached us. "Mrs. Bedford, this is the vehicle you ordered 2 days ago," he announced, his voice carrying clearly to where Emily stood with her biological father, Jack Wilson. Also, the company's operations have fully resumed after the temporary freeze. Would you like to issue any additional directives for the quarterly planning meeting? The blood drained from Emily's face so quickly, I thought she might faint. This wasn't some performance to save face. It was reality. The legal dispute that had caused the temporary freeze had been resolved exactly as my attorneys had predicted. My company was fine, my fortune intact. And she had shown her true colors when it didn't matter in the slightest. This can't be happening, she stammered, her carefully applied makeup suddenly stark against her pallor. You did this on purpose to humiliate me. I said nothing, maintaining the same calm dignity I'd cultivated through decades of high-stakes business negotiations. The truth needed no defense from me. Jack, who moments ago had been radiating smug satisfaction, now looked like he'd swallowed something sour. Sweat beaded on his forehead as understanding dawned. If I'd never actually been bankrupt, then he'd been played for a fool by his own daughter. Mrs. Bedford, he stammered, stepping forward with forced politeness. So you really didn't go bankrupt after all. I didn't bother answering him directly. Richard stepped in smoothly. Mrs. Bedford has always remained the acting head of the company. The so-called bankruptcy was nothing more than a misinterpretation. A temporary asset freeze was caused by malicious interference from a former employee. Everything has since returned to normal. He reached into his pocket and handed Jack a business card. If you have concerns, you're welcome to visit our corporate offices. Jack's hand trembled as he took the card, his face ashen. He turned suddenly on Emily, fury replacing his earlier confidence. You idiot, he snapped. You said she was broke. You said she had nothing left. You dragged me here to humiliate her. Now, look who's being humiliated. I watched their private drama unfold with detached interest. 7 years ago, I'd met Emily through a youth outreach program where I volunteered after my husband's death. She was cycling through her third foster home, her mother imprisoned on drug charges. Her father, the same Jack Wilson, largely absent except when he needed money. When I first approached her, she'd been a withdrawn 16-year-old clutching a tattered notebook. What do you need? I'd asked gently. Without looking up, she'd whispered, just a place where I can sleep in peace. Those words had touched something in me, leading to months of paperwork, home studies, and eventually adoption. I'd welcomed her into my Beacon Hill home, supported her through college, brought her to business functions, and taught her everything I knew about financial independence, never once suspecting she viewed me as nothing more than a funding source. Now, as their argument escalated on the courthouse steps, Emily suddenly dropped to her knees in front of me, clutching at my coat. Tears streamed down her face, smearing expensive makeup. Mom, please, she sobbed. I was wrong. I made a terrible mistake. You can hit me, yell at me, anything. Just take me back. I looked down at her, unmoved. This wasn't remorse. It was panic. Not fear of losing me, but of losing the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to. With quiet dignity, I turned to Richard. Cancel her access to all trust accounts. Terminate any financial benefits she's receiving. Remove her from all company systems. Richard nodded. Understood. Mrs. Bedford, I'll have everything processed by this afternoon. No, Emily scrambled to her feet. You can't do this to me. I stepped back, avoiding her reaching hands. You made your choice, Emily. You signed the termination agreement with your own hands. You wanted freedom. Now you have it. Her face hardened as she realized pleading wouldn't work. You think this means you've won, she spat. You'll regret this. You're just an old woman with no one who truly loves you. I remained silent, watching as her insults grew increasingly desperate. Jack, seeing his meal ticket evaporating, tried to distance himself from his daughter's behavior. Before leaving, I instructed Richard to add both of them to the company's security blacklist. As of now, I said without looking back, you no longer exist in my world. Driving home in my new car, I felt strangely peaceful. 3 years of memories had unraveled in mere hours, but perhaps that was for the best. I hadn't lost a daughter, I'd simply discovered I never truly had one. Months later, after receiving Emily's letter of apology, I arranged an anonymous scholarship for her vocational training, not out of forgiveness, but because I believed in second chances, even if those chances couldn't include me. You seem remarkably resilient, observed Daniel, a community foundation director I'd met at a charity function. It's not resilience, I replied. It's finally understanding what truly matters and what doesn't. And from this moment forward, you are no longer a part of my life. My words hung in the air between us, calm and final. Sarah's face, still wet with theatrical tears, froze in shock. She had anticipated anger, perhaps negotiation not this quiet, immovable certainty. Just moments before, she had been on her knees outside the courthouse, clutching my coat and sobbing about how sorry she was, how she'd made a terrible mistake in trying to terminate our adoption. But I knew better. This wasn't remorse, it was calculation. The same cold calculation that had led her to produce termination papers the instant she believed I was financially ruined. Now that she knew my assets had been unfrozen and my company was thriving, she wanted back into my life, or more accurately, back into my wallet. At 67, I've learned that some breaks can't be mended and some betrayals cut too deep for second chances. I turned to my assistant, Michael, who stood quietly nearby. Cancel her access to all trust accounts, I instructed. Terminate any financial benefit she's receiving. Remove her from all company systems. Michael nodded with professional efficiency. Understood, Mrs. Reynolds. I'll have everything processed by this afternoon. Freeze all her credit cards, I continued. Revoke access to any residences and vehicles under my name. No more internal assistance of any kind. Sarah's panic escalated as the reality of her situation dawned. No, you can't do this to me. She scrambled to her feet, reaching for me. I stepped back, avoiding her touch. You made your choice, Sarah. You signed the termination agreement with your own hands. You wanted freedom, now you have it. 7 years earlier, I had welcomed a troubled 16-year-old foster child into my Westport home, not far from the Connecticut shoreline. I'd supported her through college, introduced her to my business associates, treated her as my daughter in every way that mattered. When she first called me Mom, I'd felt a warmth I never expected to experience at this stage of my life. But it had all been a performance. The moment she thought I had nothing left to give, she walked away without a backward glance, taking what valuables she could carry. Now, as her pleas turned to threats, I remained unmoved. You think this means you've won? She spat, her voice thick with venom. You'll regret this. You're just an old woman with no one who truly loves you. Her biological father, who had been standing awkwardly nearby throughout this exchange, shifted uncomfortably as she continued her tirade. I simply watched, seeing with perfect clarity what I should have recognized years ago. Her warmth, her dependence, her affection, all of it had been transactional. Add both of them to the company's security blacklist, I told Michael. They're banned from all buildings and affiliated properties. Sarah's face contorted with rage as she realized the finality of my decision. Fine, you think you've won. Just wait. I'll crush you one day. As of now, I said without looking back as I walked toward my car. You no longer exist in my world. The strange thing was how peaceful I felt afterward. Driving home in my new car, I realized I hadn't lost a daughter. I'd simply confirmed I never truly had one. 3 years of memories unraveled in mere hours, scattered and hollow. But perhaps that was for the best. It wasn't that I was heartless. I had once loved her deeply, truly tried to raise her into a strong and decent woman. She had once served me tea in the kitchen, once tried clumsily but earnestly to throw me a surprise birthday dinner. But a heart doesn't rot overnight, and deep down I knew if I hadn't stood at the top of the financial ladder, she would have never worn her mask so convincingly. People might call you cold for cutting her off completely, babe, remarked James, a thoughtful community leader I met months later at a charity function. Perhaps, I replied, but there's a difference between forgiveness and foolishness. Some bridges, once burned, should stay that way. The doorbell echoed through my quiet home, interrupting my first moment of peace in days. When I opened the door, the scene before me was so theatrically pathetic I nearly laughed. Robert Taylor stood awkwardly on my threshold, his posture stiff with forced humility. Beside him knelt his daughter Amanda, my former adopted daughter, her head bowed in an almost medieval display of penitence. "Kneel," Robert barked the moment he saw me, though Amanda was already on her knees. She flinched at his command, her eyes filled with panic as she mumbled, "Mrs. Cunningham, I was wrong. I truly was." Robert wrung his hands nervously, attempting to sound apologetic. "Mrs. Cunningham, she's young and foolish. I've already given her a harsh lesson. Please, maybe just give her one more chance." Amanda's voice was hoarse from crying, her face streaked with tears, her normally perfect hair disheveled. Faint red welts marked her wrists and neck, signs of what might have been a physical confrontation. She kept her head down like a prisoner awaiting judgment, her entire body trembling. I looked at her without emotion. 7 years ago, I had welcomed a defiant 16-year-old girl into my Vermont home. I'd filed paperwork, endured home studies, attended parenting classes, and eventually adopted her formally. I'd supported her through school, brought her to corporate events, shared Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations. Yet 3 days of financial uncertainty had been enough for her to discard our relationship completely, signing termination papers she'd prepared in advance. What had all that time and effort brought me greed, selfishness, betrayal. What she suffered now was nothing more than the consequence of her own choices. As Robert grew more anxious, his mouth twitching while his gaze darted between Amanda and me, light laughter and chatter approached from behind them. "Is Amanda here? We're heading to the club together." 2 stylish young women appeared at my doorstep, looking me over with polite disinterest before noticing the kneeling figure. Their eyes widened as recognition dawned. "Amanda, what the hell are you doing?" one asked, bewildered. Amanda's face drained of color. She scrambled to her feet in panic, fumbling for an explanation. "It's not what it looks like," I can explain. But I had already seen through the mask she wore so well. What she valued most had never been love or family. It was appearances, image, pride, and this public humiliation was something she could never endure. I gently raised my hand, stopping her mid-sentence, and turned to the 2 girls with a calm, composed expression. "Amanda was once my adopted daughter," I said with a soft smile. "A few days ago, she assumed my company had gone bankrupt, and she immediately cut ties with me." I tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear and added almost conversationally, "Unfortunately for her, that was all part of a temporary situation, and now someone's regretting her hasty decision." Amanda swayed slightly, as if my words had physically struck her. The color drained from her face completely as her friends exchanged knowing glances, then smirked with undisguised amusement. "I knew it," one scoffed. "She always bragged about how much money she had, acting like some self-important heiress. What a joke." "How can you say that?" Amanda whispered, her voice cracking. "I gave you gifts, bought designer bags for you." "You think we cared?" the other girl snapped with a cold smile. "You really thought a couple of handbags would buy friendship? Grow up." "Amanda." With that, they turned and walked away without another word. Not even a goodbye. Amanda stood frozen, her lips quivering as she struggled to maintain composure. I really know I was wrong," she finally said. Her voice choked, her previous arrogance completely gone. "You loved me so much once. Don't I deserve a second chance?" I looked at her carefully, not with hesitation, but with perfect clarity. I wanted to see if she finally understood what she had truly lost. But in her gaze, I saw no genuine remorse, only helplessness, only fear. She wasn't sorry. She was just afraid of returning to the life she thought she had escaped. "Amanda," I said softly but firmly, "the most extravagant thing in this world isn't a luxury car or a designer bag. It's a person's heart, and you've already spent it all." Her face fell completely. She knew this time it was truly over. Without another word, she turned and walked away. Robert lingered, trying one last time to reason with me. But when he saw my resolve, he muttered a curse and followed after his daughter. I stood in the doorway, watching them disappear down my driveway. 7 years of memories had unraveled in mere days. It wasn't that I was heartless. I had once loved her deeply. But now I understood that what truly allowed me to let go wasn't whether she repented, but the realization that there was no longer any need to hold on. The afternoon light streamed through my office windows, casting long shadows across my desk. I had just finished reviewing quarterly projections when Thomas, my assistant, knocked softly at the door. "Miss Sullivan," he said, his voice gentle. "This just came in. It's a courier delivery. The sender is Rebecca." I paused, my hand hovering over the document I'd been annotating. Rebecca, my former adopted daughter, hadn't contacted me in weeks. Not since that day at the courthouse when I'd revealed my assets were unfrozen, and she'd realized the magnitude of her mistake. Thomas placed a deep blue document envelope on my desk, sealed with a gold-edged label. It was the kind Rebecca had always preferred. "It's the little details that define true taste," she used to say, usually while justifying some extravagant purchase. I thanked Thomas and waited until he left before opening the envelope. Inside were several sheets of legal paperwork and a neatly folded, handwritten letter. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, though stripped of the usual flourishes and flair that characterized her normal correspondence. "Catherine, I know I no longer have the right to call you Mom, but please allow me to write this letter. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not trying to earn your sympathy. I just wanted to offer a little sincerity, however late it may be, to make sense of this relationship that spiraled out of control." I leaned back in my chair, taking in each line carefully, the sincerity in her unpolished words settling in quietly. Recently, I found myself back in the place I thought I'd left behind my dad's apartment. It's old, damp, and the hot water takes over an hour to come on. Only then did I truly understand the kind of life you gave me, how vastly different it was from everything I knew before. But my regret isn't just about hardship. It's not about missing the comfort. I regret that when I tore away the label of being your daughter, I also ripped apart every piece of my life that was worth honoring and being grateful for. I thought about the day she had come into my life, a defiant 16-year-old, in her third foster home. Her mother imprisoned on drug charges, her father intermittently present and wholly unreliable. During a volunteer session at a Boston youth outreach program, she had caught my attention by her honesty when asked what she needed. Just a place where I can sleep in peace. 6 months and countless meetings with social services later, she had moved into my Beacon Hill brownstone. I had decorated her room in the soft blues and greens she preferred, bought her first real winter coat, celebrated her birthdays with the kind of thoughtfulness she claimed to have never experienced before. For 7 years, I had believed we were building something meaningful, until 3 days of financial uncertainty revealed it had all been conditional. It took me an entire week to gather the courage to write this letter, and if I were just trying to win you over, I wouldn't have included the legal documents enclosed. I'm voluntarily returning everything you once gave me. I don't deserve to hold on to any part of your world, but I do hope, even if not as a daughter, at least as someone you once showed kindness to, I can give myself a chance to start again. By the time I finished reading the final sentence, my fingertips had gone slightly cold. I'm not someone who softens easily, but in that moment, I didn't feel cold either. I remembered Rebecca at 17, trying so earnestly to bake me a birthday cake that she set off the smoke alarms. Rebecca at 19, nervously introducing me to her college professors. Rebecca at 21, standing proudly beside me at a company function, clearly imitating my posture and speech patterns. Had it all been nothing but calculation, or was there something genuine beneath the performance that even she hadn't recognized until it was gone? I knew she might still be immature, might not fully understand the weight of her actions, but she had finally begun to face herself, and that was the beginning of growth. I didn't write back. I simply placed the letter gently to the side, next to the legal documents returning ownership of the property and vehicle she had given to her father. That evening, I instructed Thomas to make a discreet, anonymous donation sponsoring Rebecca's enrollment in a vocational retraining program focused on market analysis, the very field she had briefly shown interest in during her time visiting my company. I had no intention of telling her where the funding came from. I didn't need her gratitude. I just hoped she wouldn't waste her second chance, the way she had wasted our relationship. Perhaps someday she would understand that true wealth isn't measured in dollars or properties, but in the moments of genuine connection we create with others. I hadn't given up on that belief, even if I had given up on being her mother. There are some bridges that, once burned, cannot be rebuilt, but that doesn't mean new paths can't emerge from the ashes. That evening, as golden sunlight filtered through my office windows, I made a decision. I would help Rachel, but she would never know it was me. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for just a moment before I began typing instructions to my assistant. Mark arrange an anonymous donation to sponsor Rachel's enrollment in a vocational retraining program focused on market analysis, the very field where she had shown a spark of genuine interest during her occasional visits to my company. Ensure there's no way to trace this back to me, I added in my email. I don't want her gratitude. I just want her to have a chance at standing on her own 2 feet. It had been 3 weeks since our final confrontation at the courthouse, where Rachel learned that my assets had never truly been frozen for more than the briefest procedural period. 3 weeks since she dropped to her knees on the courthouse steps, sobbing not from genuine remorse, but from the shock of having miscalculated so severely. 3 weeks since I'd looked into her eyes and said, "From this moment forward, you are no longer a part of my life." Her letter had arrived that morning, elegant blue stationery she'd always preferred, her handwriting stripped of its usual flourishes. "I know I no longer have the right to call you Mom," she'd written, "but I hope you'll allow me this chance to offer sincerity, however late it may be." She described returning to her father's cramped apartment in Queens, with its unreliable hot water and persistent draft, writing that only then did she truly understand the life I had given her. "My regret isn't about missing comfort," she'd written. "When I tore away the label of being your daughter, I ripped apart every piece of my life worth honoring and being grateful for." At 66, after building Anderson Enterprises from nothing into a thriving corporation with offices across New England, I'd learned to distinguish between authentic communication and strategic positioning. Rachel's letter had surprised me with its unvarnished honesty. She'd enclosed legal documents returning the property and vehicle she had given her father, writing that she didn't deserve to keep any part of my world. I hadn't responded directly. Some bridges, once burned, cannot be rebuilt, especially when the fire was set deliberately. With termination papers prepared in advance, ready to be produced the moment my wealth seemed to disappear, I remembered Rachel at 16, a defensive girl I'd met through a youth outreach program in Manhattan. Her mother was serving time for drug charges, her father intermittently present and wholly unreliable. "What do you need?" I'd asked during our first meeting. Without looking up, she'd whispered, "Just a place where I can sleep in peace." Something in that simple request had moved me. 6 months of paperwork, home studies, and background checks later, she moved into my Upper East Side townhouse. I'd supported her through high school and college, brought her to business functions, shared Sunday brunches and holiday celebrations. For 7 years, I believed we were building something genuine, until 3 days of financial uncertainty revealed it had all been conditional. "The anonymous sponsorship is confirmed." Mark replied to my email. The program director was thrilled they've apparently had their eye on Rachel as a promising candidate, but couldn't offer financial assistance. I closed my laptop and walked to the window, looking out over Central Park as the setting sun gilded the treetops. I wasn't doing this from a place of forgiveness. Some betrayals cut too deeply for that. I was doing it because, at her core, underneath the calculation and self-interest, Rachel had potential that had been warped by her father's influence and her early years of instability, but potential nonetheless. Perhaps in this way, free from the complications of our former relationship, she might find a path forward that was truly her own. "You're more generous than most would be in your position," my friend Judith remarked when I confided in her over dinner the following week. "Many would simply walk away completely." "It's not generosity, Kate," I replied, swirling the Cabernet in my glass. "It's pragmatism. The cycle breaks somewhere, or it doesn't break at all." I never reached out to Rachel again, but through community connections, I occasionally heard updates. She was attending her courses diligently. Her attendance record was impeccable. She'd even volunteered for the mentorship program, helping newer students find their footing. It made me think that perhaps she was starting to understand true redemption doesn't come from others handing you a second chance. It comes when you stand up and create one for yourself. I didn't interfere with her new life, just as I hoped no one would interfere with mine. Late at night, when moonlight spilled across my desk, as I turned pages in the novel I'd been slowly working through, I sometimes thought about the letter she'd sent, not with regret or longing, but with a quiet acknowledgement that growth often comes from our most painful lessons. Perhaps that was the most valuable gift I could have given her, after all, not financial support, but the space to discover her own strength. Life returned to normal faster than I expected. In my 67 years, I'd weathered many storms building Patterson Industries from a small regional operation into a national corporation, losing my husband to cancer a decade ago, navigating the loneliness that follows such profound loss. But nothing had prepared me for the betrayal of someone I'd come to think of as a daughter, or for how swiftly I would rise from those ashes. The crisis at the company had passed, resolved through careful negotiation and strategic patience. My assets, temporarily frozen during a legal dispute, had been released exactly as my attorneys predicted. What I hadn't anticipated was how the brief financial uncertainty would act as a truth serum, revealing that my relationship with Olivia, my adopted daughter of 7 years, had been built entirely on the foundation of my wealth. Now that Ms. Patterson's back, we've got direction again. I overheard one department head whisper to another as I walked through the office corridors on my first day back. I smiled, quietly pleased by the sentiment. The company had always been my first child in many ways, something I'd nurtured from infancy, watched grow, guided through difficulties with a steady hand. Now I recommitted myself to it with renewed energy and vision. Each morning, I stood at the head of the conference room, breaking down strategic blueprints with clarity and precision. I revived a long-delayed interstate market integration project that had stalled during my brief absence and began reconstructing the company's core business framework. My colleagues no longer saw me merely as the founder and CEO, but as something more, an anchor, a symbol of resilience and purpose. But the most profound changes happened outside the boardroom, in the private spaces of my life that had long been neglected while I focused on building both a business and a relationship with Olivia. I planted the first sprig of lavender in the garden behind my Massachusetts colonial Olivia's favorite scent once upon a time. On sunlit afternoons, I'd brew Earl Grey tea, sit in the wicker chair on my porch, and watch the breeze flutter through the flowers. Neighbors would stop by to chat, and for the first time in years, I felt truly present in these simple interactions rather than mentally tallying all the tasks still awaiting my attention. I converted the upstairs guest room, the one that had been Olivia's before she moved into her own apartment, into an art studio. I hadn't touched a paintbrush since college, and my initial attempts were laughably amateur. But the process brought a meditative quality to my evenings. There was something profoundly satisfying about creating something purely for the joy of it, with no quarterly projections or stakeholder expectations attached. I even began planning a trip to the Rockies, not the quick business jaunts I'd grown accustomed to, but a real departure. 2 weeks in Colorado, perhaps, to see the aspens turn golden in the fall, or to visit the coastal towns of Maine I'd always wanted to explore. Not an escape, but a deliberate engagement with a world beyond the one I'd carefully constructed around myself. Sometimes William would join me for dinner, a thoughtful community foundation director I'd met at a charity function. There wasn't any sweeping romance between us. He was simply a kind, intelligent man whose company I enjoyed. We talked about books, politics, philanthropy, and occasionally the quieter regrets of our past. There was no urgency to define what we were to each other, no pressure to fill the roles that others expected of people our age. I found it refreshing to simply enjoy someone's presence without analyzing its potential or purpose. "You seem steadier than most people I know," he remarked one evening as we shared a bottle of Cabernet on my porch. I laughed gently. It's not steadiness. It's learning not to cling so tightly anymore. And it was true. The loss of Olivia, or rather, the loss of who I believed Olivia to be, had taught me something profound about attachment. I had invested so much in that relationship, believing that being a mother, even to a young woman I'd met when she was nearly grown, would somehow complete something missing in my life. When she revealed that our bond had been nothing more than a financial arrangement for her, walking away the moment my assets were frozen, the pain had been acute. But in that pain came clarity. Happiness doesn't depend on possessing people or accumulating wealth. It emerges when we no longer fear what might be lost. Once you find the courage to walk alone, truly alone with your thoughts and feelings and aspirations, you realize you already have everything you need. Outside my window, the moonlight spilled across the garden I'd planted, illuminating the lavender that now thrived. I turned a page in the novel I'd been slowly working through, letting my fingers trace the quiet texture of the paper. This year I had lost so much, and yet gained even more, a renewed sense of purpose, rediscovered passions, and most importantly, the knowledge that I was both strong enough and soft enough to meet whatever tomorrow might bring. There's still so much I don't know about the future, but this much is certain: the path forward is mine alone to walk. And for the first time in decades, that thought brings me not anxiety, but a profound, abiding peace. The moonlight spilled across my desk as I turned another page in my novel, fingers tracing the quiet texture of the paper. In the garden below, the lavender I'd planted, Abigail's favorite scent, once swayed gently in the evening breeze. This year had brought profound changes to my life at 67. The daughter I thought I knew had revealed herself a stranger when my assets were temporarily frozen, cutting ties with termination papers she'd prepared in advance. But in losing her, I discovered something unexpected: freedom. After our final confrontation at the courthouse, where she learned my fortune had returned and begged for reconciliation, I chose to walk away, not from anger, but from clarity. I returned to my company with renewed purpose, reviving projects long delayed and reclaiming my confidence as a leader. I converted her old room into an art studio, rediscovering passions I'd set aside decades ago. I planted gardens, planned travels to the mountains of Colorado, and found companionship with James, a thoughtful community foundation director whose conversation brought warmth to my evenings without expectation. Through this journey, I finally understood the most precious wisdom of all. Happiness doesn't come from possessing people or accumulating wealth. It emerges when we no longer fear what might be lost. Once you find the courage to walk alone, truly alone with your thoughts and aspirations, you realize you already have everything you need. Dear friends, this story teaches us perhaps life's most profound truth. True wealth isn't measured in bank accounts or properties, but in our courage to stand firmly in our own worth. We spend so much of our lives fearing abandonment, clinging to relationships that drain us, afraid that being alone means being diminished. But as someone who's traveled this difficult path, I can tell you with absolute certainty, the moment you stop fearing loss is the moment you gain everything. When relationships are conditional on what you provide rather than who you are, they aren't relationships at all. They're transactions. And while walking away may feel impossible in the moment, remember that on the other side of that painful choice lies a freedom you cannot imagine until you experience it. The courage to say enough when someone values your assets more than your heart is the beginning of true self-respect. Have you ever faced the difficult choice between keeping a relationship and honoring your worth? Share your story in the comments below. Your journey might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to find their own courage today. And if this message resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us of our inherent value and strength. Together, we're learning that sometimes the heaviest chains we break are the ones we place upon ourselves.